Cosmologos, Tetragrammaton, and the Logos Word. The Symbolic, Kabbalistic, and Mystic Keys to Universal Understanding by Daniel Gautier. Part 4.
So Robert Fludd, the 17th century philosopher who has been associated with the Rosicrucian tradition and was very much influenced by not only Platonism as a Christian Platonist, but also the Kabbalah. And in many respects, he's trying to reconcile the differences between the Kabbalah and Judaism and Christianity. So he went into some detail in terms of the emanations of the Kabbalah, and this diagram from one of his books that shows how these eternal principles, eternal ideas, or in this case, names of God, which are basically aspects of the Logos, are all emanated from the source, the Logos seed matrix, in this case, the Tetragrammaton, Yod He Vav He. And this is a cosmograph which incorporates this teaching and belief of everything descending from the eternal seed, the Logos, because at the top we have in the little cloud of unknowing, this is the mind of God that's unmanifest. Chained to this Tetragrammaton is the anima mundi, or the soul of the world. And this relates to ideas in Plato's dialogue, the Timaeus. And this soul of the world is what receives the primal inclinations and the logoic antecedents. And here you just have the typical Renaissance cosmology, from the center of the terrestrial world to the celestial world, which is the planetary star world, to the celestial world, which is the divine ideas in the angelic realm. And the whole intention of these models and the Rosicrucian models, which arose from the Platonic notion that the soul that is trapped in the body in the terrestrial world, by identification with these eternal ideas that are related to number, the quadrivium and the mathematical disciplines of astronomy, mathematics, geometry, and music. By attuning to this, the soul can rise through these three spheres and ultimately return to unity with divinity, and thus ultimately the Tetragrammaton, which lies within the mind of the unknowable God. And here's another diagram from his books, which relates the macrocosmos, and above all, again, we have the Tetragrammaton. The macrocosmos is the greater cosmos that contains these eternal ideas, and beneath that is the microcosm, which is the natural world. And one of his books was called The Microcosm and the Macrocosm. And the conduit or intermediary between these two worlds is humanity. And that's where the figure here we have of the universal atom. So the human body is a receptacle of all these forces, the terrestrial, the celestial, and the supercelestial. So intersecting this archetypal model of humanity are the sun and the stars and the various intervals in music, relating it to the Pythagorean initiatory scheme. So here, this is a condensation of all these traditions united into one figure, which was the intent of Robert Fludd. And again, is an extension of Pico dell'Amendola's 900 Thesis and this principle of syncretism, tying together all the religious traditions and mystical traditions. Jacob Boehme, referred to as the Teutonic philosopher or theosopher, was a common cobbler, at least initially. And when he was 25, he had a revelation, as it were, of his mind, his consciousness opening up to the eternal powers. And in a sense, he received an imprint of the Logos, which has been described by other great mystics. And he described this experience, and it's a rather famous anecdote, where he was looking at a pewter plate and the light flashed off, and when it flashed into his eyes, he had this illumination. So it's like a reception of the solar essence. And I must say that the solar Logos and all these sun gods and Christ as the Logos, the embodiment of God, it's in terms of this this logoic source that lies at the center of the sun and all creation, and with all light, the light of the sun carries these seeds, these unmanifest seeds. After this experience, and he had other subsequent similar experiences which corroborated this initial revelation. He started writing these rather cryptic books, and he didn't really have a language to use to describe these vast forces. So he drew upon the Hermetic tradition, which is to say the alchemical emblem books and the alchemical writings of the time. And these writings are basically have absorbed the Platonic and Pythagorean teachings. And here is his statement of the word, which reflects what others have said preceding him.
The outward world is expressed out of the inward, through the moving of the eternal speaking word. The inward world abides in the eternal speaking word. The eternal word speaks it into being through wisdom.
So the outward world is expressed out of the inward, which is another means of declaring the macrocosmic, microcosmic correspondence, and as we saw in Robert Flood's diagram there. And he provided an expression of this logoic progression through his writings. And one of his seminal works was called Signatura Rerum, which is the signature of all things. Again, this is his name for the logos. This is an illustration, an illumination from one of the books by Athanasius Kirchner, who I mentioned earlier, who was influenced by Platonism but even more so perhaps the Kabbalah. And this is actually an illustration to his book on vision. But in essence, it's a diagram of how the logos expresses itself and manifests itself through the material world. And these emblems and these auctores, or authors of divine wisdom, it's going to be broken down in subsequent lectures, depending upon the time period that's involved. And we'll go into greater discussion about the meaning of the symbolism. But basically, you have this polarity between, on the left, the Apollonian, the light principle, and the right, the Dionysian, the dark principle. And at bottom right, we have the cave, which is a reference to the cave of Plato in his Dialogue of the Republic, talking about how humanity is enclosed in this cave and sees only the reflections of these eternal forms. And there are fires up above them, and from the shadows, the fire, like Heraclitus, provides the logoic or eternal idea source. But we down here in the bodies of the material world see just the reflections. So this is just a cosmological diagram of the ascent from the reflected variations on these unchanging ideas and the ascent through the balancing of reason and impulse, Dionysus and Apollo, to the seed source, the Tetragrammaton, at the very top of the illumination. William Blake gave a quite individualized interpretation or extension of the Logos through his mythological works. Again, when we discuss the Romantic period in this tradition, we will go into great detail about William Blake and his teachings. But he created this mythology of these four divine beings, what he called his eternals, and he called them the four Zoas. Now, Zoas comes from the Greek meaning life, and it referred to the tetramorph in the early Kabbalistic Merkaba tradition. So you can basically provide an analogy between his four mythical entities that are shown with the cosmic egg there on the right, and the analogies can be made between the logos.
The four living creatures, chariots of humanity, divine, incomprehensible, redounded from their tongues in thunderous majesty, in visions, in new expanses, creating exemplar of memory and of intellect, creating space, creating time, according to the wonders of human imagination, throughout all the three regions immense of childhood, manhood, and old age.
So the profundity of William Blake is quite immense. And his great gift was of being able to translate these very abstract notions, these fundamental forces, in terms of his own mythology, providing a very unique mask beyond the traditional iconography of standard religions. And four living creatures, chariots of humanity, again, that's drawn from Ezekiel and Ezekiel, the prophet, being taken up into the heavens with unity with God through the chariot, which is called the Merkabah. And the whole Merkabah mysticism arose from Ezekiel's experience. And William Blake was immersed in the iconography of the Bible, although his definition of Jesus or Christ was quite different. He described Christ as eternal imagination. And he talks about creating a world based on these fundamental principles, which is what he did, according to the wonders of a human imagination, about the three regions immense of childhood, manhood, and old age. And I can't help but reading that last three words, childhood, manhood, and old age, and thinking of Oedipus and the Sphinx. And Oedipus, that's the aspiring soul, or the initiate in the initiatory traditions, confronting the fourfold Sphinx. And the fourfold Sphinx, of course, is this Tetragrammaton. So the initiate comes face to face with the Tetragrammaton, but it's in the form of these four animals, which correspond to the four letters of the Tetragrammaton. But what the Sphinx acts, in order for the initiate or the soul, the aspiring soul, to pass to the divine world, is to answer a riddle. And if you don't answer the riddle, you die. And the riddle is, what walks on four legs in the morning, two legs in the afternoon, and three legs in the evening? And the answer is, it's humanity, or the man or the woman, walking on hands and legs as a child, erect as an adult, and with three appendages with the cane as an old person. And this is not just another way of saying, before you pass into these greater realms, these macrocosmic, all-inclusive, and quite abstract realms, you have to have an understanding of the three phases of life and the three levels of the world, which we referred to previously in Flood and other philosophers: the terrestrial, the celestial, and the super-celestial, or the material, the world of the soul, and the world of the spirit. And understand how these original ideas, powers, forces permeate the world and are manifest in this world. And if you can read this language, this symbolic language, this language of theme and variations, as in a complex Bach fugue, if you can understand the interrelationships between all these parts on these three levels, then you will be able to pass into this divine realm and become an equal in that realm and fully cognizant of the powers that lie there.
Now I a fourfold vision see, and a fourfold vision is given to me. 'Tis fourfold in my supreme delight, and threefold in soft Beulah's night, and twofold always may God us keep from single vision and Newton's sleep.
He's essentially explaining how he came to these mythic forms and creating these prophetic books, his last two in particular. His two great illuminated works, which he called his prophecies, the book of Milton and the book of Jerusalem. And his mythic creatures evolved to an extent, these four Zoas. But he had this vision, probably akin to what Jacob Boehmer experienced. He had this flash, or this download, like a digital, complete universal download of these fourfold forces at their source. And what these mystics do, they are capable of seeing the world around them through the lens of these forces, and they're printed like a seal on their soul, which is what I believe St. John in Revelation was speaking of about the seals. So it's the ultimate, 'tis fourfold in my supreme delight. He has an ecstatic experience of the world around him because he can see the world reduced to these few omnipotent, omnipresent forces, ideas, these kernels of creation. And this is just a final variant on this fourfold law. And these are four paintings of mine which depict four tattvas, which are the elemental creative forces in the Sankhya Hindu philosophy. And here we have correspondences which can be made with the Tetragrammaton, the Tetractes, or the four archangels. In the upper right, we have the fire principle, tejas. To the left, we have the water principle, apas. Beneath that, the air principle, vayu, the blue. And to the right, prithivi, which is the earth. Or again, going from the top right, yod, he, feminine, vav, androgynous sun, and he, which is the earth. And at the center is, in this system, and the central black circle just refers to the unmanifest principle from which the later logos is derived, from this cloud or womb of unknowing and undifferentiation. So everything that we see, experience, everything that we know is unknowingly a part of these primal seeds, the logos, Tetragrammaton, pentadic matrix. And in a slight digression, but to show how this universal matrical logoic principle can be found in other traditions, not only in the West, but in the East. We have an equivalent in the universal mantra, the Om, or AUM, as it's often spelled in some cases more accurately. This Sanskrit symbol also provides a model of the threefold logos. And this painting, it's one of my paintings of the dyad. So we have two versions of the universal mantra symbol. As you can see, the sound seed, the universal mantra, the Om, is rendered in many different forms depending upon the calligraphy or the aesthetic orientation. Because in the center we have a rather elaborate painting where you can generally detect the similarities, but it's a bit more abstracted, a bit more linear than the curvilinear outside depictions. Inside they have the various gods and goddesses, and lying down in the red there is Brahma Trimurti. And the Trimurti refers to the threefold divinity, which is pretty well known in terms of Brahma, who's the creator, Vishnu is the preserver, and Shiva is the destroyer, and ultimately the regenerator, he who destroys to regenerate anew in spiritual terms. So these can be equated with the matrix seed in terms of Brahma is the father principle, the fire principle. That's why he's wearing red. And Vishnu would correspond to the second principle, the feminine receptacle principle. And actually, Vishnu, in that respect, has more of a feminine nature, feminine qualities. And Shiva is the androgyne there, the third principle. And in the configuration of the Om symbol on the right and the left, the yellow figures, at the top, you have what you can equate with the Yud in the Tetragrammaton. It's like a little flame or a point. It's the singularity. It's the monad. And beneath it, well, you have a curved shape that looks like a crescent or a moon. That's the lunar principle. And beneath that, and so the first seed there, the monad or the spirit, looks like the dot or the flame, and that's associated with Brahma, and the curve would be the Vishnu receptive. And the third part, the lower part, would be Shiva, which is rather threefold. You have the two pointing to the left, which is the feminine principle, and the one that's pretty nearly a circle, which is on the right, and that's the masculine principle. So what happens is in these iconographies, be they verbal or visual, human consciousness draws upon these archetypes that are at the base of one's being, or you can think of them in terms of Jungian psychology, at the root of our collective unconscious and the recesses of our unconscious being. And from one of the Upanishads, there's a description of the AUM.
Aum is the quintessence of the essences, the highest, the supreme. Threefold knowledge proceeds with it.
So this is the equivalent of the first three principles of the Tetractes, or the first three letters on the Tetragrammaton. Again, the quintessence, and it's interesting to note that quintessence is a word that's used in philosophical alchemy quite a bit. And it's also the fifth spiritual principle, according to Aristotle, where you have the four elements, four familiar elements, fire, water, air, and earth. And the fifth is this unmanifest essence, which is the highest, the supreme. It's basically the unmanifest logos. It's the India Thetos logos, as mentioned by Clement of Alexandria. And all knowledge proceeds with it. So as this matrix emanates from the unmanifest, its stamp is impressed into all matter, and all forms are variants of these impresses. And again, you see just the letters of AUM, the English letters. What is the first principle? It's the A. Again, that's the symbol in these mystical traditions, East and West. It's a symbol of fire, an upward pointing triangle, because that is the shape of fire. If you make a fire, you have this upward triangle of heat and energy. And the second one, a U. What again do you see? You see the crescent, the receptive principle, the receptacle of Plato that receives the imprint of the first seed. And the M is basically, it's twofold. It's three on the bottom uniting the two, which implies the fifth or the pentad. But it also demonstrates the idea of the third principle being the androgyne, and a merger of the two polarities at the top in the letter M with the three on the bottom, which is the sun, S-O-N, S-U-N, who provides the point of balance between the two polarities. Now this sound seed, the universal mantra Om, or AUM, is used in Raja Yoga and Kundalini Yoga. Its intonation is used to raise the spiritus, the divine energy, from the base of one's spine to the top of one's head. And for those that are familiar with the Kundalini Yoga systems and the Raja Yoga systems and the systems of chakras, these are the wheels of invisible power that are aligned up with the spine. And you can make analogies between these and the Sephiroth, the spheres in the Kabbalistic tree of life, or the Ptolemaic spheres in ancient Greece and medieval times. So these are all models of the centers of energy and idea. And the intention in any of those systems, be it in the Kabbalah, you're trying to raise up through the Sephiroth to the highest levels of being. Same thing in the Kundalini Raja Yoga system. And part of the mythos of Kundalini Yoga is the belief that the human body was created, formed by the Kundali Shakti, which is the divine creative principle in feminine form, the divine goddess Shakti, consort of Shiva, descends down the spine and comes to rest at the base of the spine. And the intention of the initiate and one who aspires to reintegration into the whole and the absolute through various techniques of manipulation of sound, breath control, focus, concentration, meditation. One raises one's energy and consciousness through these spheres to the body up into the higher realms of the absolute and the ideal realm. And this is one of my paintings depicting this process. And it's a cryptogram, symbolic cosmological model. And at the bottom, you have, borrowing from another tradition, the Western tradition, you have Osiris in the box, which is basically this divine energy that's been imprisoned at the base of being, as it's at the base of our spine, the Muladhara chakra. And the chakra is the name of these wheels. So you're raising from the base of the earth, and the energy goes up the seven chakras, out the top of the head, the 1,000-petal lotus. And there's a stained glass window there, which for me is an allusion to, in the Kabbalah, this sphere that's called Tifereth, which is beauty, eternal beauty. And finally, you go up to the unmanifest or the luminous sun at the very top. And in the Mayatri Upanishad, it speaks of this progression and transmutation from the material to the spiritual and divine.
There is a channel called the Shushumna, leading upward, conveying the breath, piercing through the palate. Through it, by joining the breath, the syllable Om, Aum, and the mind, one may go aloft.